Blake Leggett and Victoria Henbury were supposed to be temporary tenants in Loretta Saunders' apartment, but within days, they became the prime suspects in her disappearance. Loretta, a passionate university student writing her thesis on missing Indigenous women, had unknowingly invited her killers into her home. What started as a simple rental agreement ended in betrayal, violence, and a chilling irony that shook the nation. Loretta Saunders was a 26-year-old university student with a vision larger than life. A proud Inuk woman from Newfoundland and Labrador. She had faced a world that often overlooked people like her, Indigenous, female, and from a marginalized background. But Loretta refused to be ignored. She had enrolled at St. Mary's University in Halifax, Nova Scotia, where she was studying criminology. Her thesis focused on a deeply personal and tragic subject, the national crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous women in Canada. For her, this wasn't just a project, it was a mission. Every statistic, every name, every story she uncovered reminded her of the dangers so many women like her faced. She wanted to shine a light on the violence that too often went unnoticed. She wanted to give those women a voice, those who knew. Loretta described her as driven, intelligent, and compassionate. She was a survivor of her own past struggles, having overcome addiction and trauma in her younger years. Her education became a second chance, and she poured her heart into her work. She had dreams of becoming a lawyer or a full-time advocate for Indigenous rights. Loretta was making progress that few from her background had the chance to make, and she carried the hopes of her family and community with pride. On the morning of February 13, 2014, Loretta was last seen alive. She had just submitted part of her thesis and was planning to meet someone at her apartment in Halifax. Her family expected to hear from her later that day, but she never called. She missed appointments, classes, and eventually went completely silent. At first, friends and family hoped it was just a misunderstanding. Maybe her phone was off, or maybe she needed a break. But as hours turned into days, fear began to grow. Loretta was not the kind of person to vanish without a word. Her family, especially her sister, started making calls, checking with hospitals, and reaching out to friends. The sense of dread intensified when police were finally alerted and began looking into her disappearance. Despite Loretta being an adult, her sudden silence and her responsible nature made it clear to those closest to her that something was terribly wrong. Authorities began asking questions and tracing her last known movements. They learned she had gone to her apartment that morning, where she had been subletting a room to a couple, Blake Leggett and Victoria Henbury. She had reportedly been having issues with them over rent and was planning to ask them to move out. The connection seemed minor at first, just part of her routine life as a student managing expenses. But the deeper investigators looked, the more unsettling the picture became. Loretta's car was missing. Her phone was off. And most disturbing of all, no one had seen or heard from her since that visit to her apartment. What started as a case of a missing student would soon unravel into a story far darker than anyone had imagined. The fight Loretta had dedicated her life to was about to reach her in the most tragic way. As the hours passed and Loretta Saunders remained missing, her family's worry turned into full-blown panic. She wasn't the kind of person to disappear. Her sister, Delilah, had a gut feeling something was terribly wrong. Loretta had always been dependable, always texting back, always calling, always letting someone know where she was. The silence was deafening. Her family contacted Halifax police, who began their investigation with basic inquiries. They checked her university, spoke to her professors, and visited her apartment building. But there were no immediate signs of struggle, no public disturbances, and no witnesses who could confirm seeing anything unusual. Loretta had simply vanished. The investigation gained urgency when police learned that Loretta's phone had been turned off the same day she disappeared. Even more concerning was the absence of her car, a blue Toyota Celica that was no longer parked where it was usually seen. Authorities issued a Canada-wide alert for the vehicle, knowing that if they found the car, they might find clues about her whereabouts. The search extended beyond Halifax, across provincial lines. It didn't take long before the first major break in the case came. Loretta's car was found almost 1,500 kilometers away in Harrow, Ontario. Inside the vehicle were two individuals, Blake Leggett and Victoria Henbury, the same couple Loretta had been subletting her apartment to. They had reportedly taken over her lease for a short period while she was sorting out personal matters, and their relationship with Loretta had recently become strained. Neighbors and classmates recalled hearing Loretta talk about needing to collect unpaid rent and possibly asking them to leave. It became clear that she had gone to speak with them on the day she disappeared. Now, the same couple was driving her car across provinces with no sign of Loretta and no clear explanation. Police arrested Blake and Victoria on the spot for theft and possession of stolen property while they worked to uncover the truth behind Loretta's disappearance. Their initial story was vague and inconsistent. They claimed she had allowed them to borrow the car, that she was away visiting friends. But phone records, security footage, and inconsistencies in their statements began to erode their credibility. The calm, rehearsed way they described events only deepened suspicion. Investigators turned their attention back to the Halifax apartment. Forensic teams scoured the place, searching for any indication of what might have happened. Hidden behind normal clutter, small signs began to emerge: cleaning supplies that had been recently used, areas of carpet that seemed oddly damp, and a faint odor of bleach. These details were not obvious at first glance, but to trained eyes, they were red flags. Something violent had likely happened there, and someone had tried to cover it up. The discovery of the car and the arrest of its occupants transformed the case from a missing persons investigation into a potential homicide. Everyone close to Loretta held their breath. The questions became sharper, and the police narrowed their focus. Where was Loretta Saunders? And why were two people who barely knew her running from the very place she had last been seen alive? As police dug deeper into the timeline of Loretta Saunders' disappearance, all signs kept pointing back to her Halifax apartment. It was the last place she had been seen and the location where her roommates, Blake Leggett and Victoria Henbury, had been staying. Authorities believed she had gone there on the morning of February 13th to collect overdue rent and possibly serve the couple with an eviction notice. What they hadn't anticipated was that this simple confrontation would turn into a crime that shocked the nation. Back in Halifax, forensic specialists examined every inch of the apartment. What initially appeared to be an ordinary space slowly revealed a more disturbing reality. There were subtle blood traces in areas that had been recently cleaned. Chemical tests confirmed blood had been present and likely scrubbed away. Fibers were found in the bathroom and living room that didn't match the existing furnishings, and an oddly placed towel was discovered behind a couch cushion. These clues pointed to something violent and sudden. Loretta had likely been killed in her own apartment, the same space she had once rented out to help support her studies. While physical evidence mounted, Blake and Victoria remained in custody. Police began separating them for individual questioning. It didn't take long before cracks formed in their story. The pressure was overwhelming. They had no explanation for driving Loretta's car across provinces, no valid reason for being in possession of her bank card, and no believable account of what happened after she visited the apartment. Investigators used phone records and surveillance footage to further corner them. At gas stations, the pair had been captured on camera using Loretta's credit card. Their calm demeanor during the trip now took on a darker meaning. They were not confused or lost, they were fleeing. After days of intense interrogation, Victoria Henbury finally broke. She confessed that Loretta had come to the apartment demanding they leave. An argument escalated. According to her account, Blake snapped. He strangled Loretta with a towel, and the couple panicked. In a calculated move, they wrapped her body in bedding, cleaned up the apartment as best they could, and placed her in the trunk of her own car. They drove for hours through snow-covered highways, looking for a place to dispose of the body. Eventually, they chose a remote area off the Trans-Canada Highway near Salisbury, New Brunswick. Following the directions Victoria provided, police dispatched a search team to the stretch of forest she described. In the frozen landscape, beneath a light dusting of snow, they found what they had feared most: Loretta Saunders' body. She had been wrapped in a patterned blanket and left among the trees like a discarded object. The sight was devastating for everyone involved. What had started as a case of a missing woman had ended in the worst possible way. The girl who had spent her academic life fighting for justice for others had herself become a victim of senseless, intimate violence. The shock was overwhelming, but for investigators, the mission shifted now to holding the killers fully accountable. The discovery of Loretta Saunders' body in the frozen woods near Salisbury, New Brunswick, marked a turning point in the investigation. It confirmed what her family had feared and what detectives had begun to suspect: Loretta had been murdered. Her body, partially concealed beneath a blanket and snow, showed signs of manual strangulation. The cold weather had preserved her remains, and forensic experts confirmed the cause of death without delay. This was no accident, no moment of panic. It was a deliberate killing, and it had been followed by days of calculated evasion. News of the recovery spread quickly, triggering shockwaves across the country. Loretta was not just another missing person, she had been actively studying the very epidemic of violence that took her life. Her thesis had focused on missing and murdered Indigenous women, a national crisis that many Canadians were only beginning to understand. Now, Loretta herself had become one of the names in that heartbreaking list. The cruel irony of it struck deeply. Her passion, her purpose, had collided fatally with her reality. Investigators used the confession from Victoria Henbury and further interviews with Blake Leggett to piece together the final moments of Loretta's life. She had entered the apartment expecting to discuss unpaid rent and likely to confront the couple about their departure. What she walked into was an explosion of tension and resentment. Blake, known to have a history of controlling behavior and violent tendencies, lost his temper. In an outburst of rage, he strangled Loretta using a towel. Victoria, by her own admission, did not intervene. She claimed to be afraid, but she stayed, helped clean the scene, and participated in the disposal of Loretta's body. She had opportunities to tell someone. She didn't. After the murder, the couple took disturbing steps to create a false sense of normalcy. They cleaned the apartment, removed evidence, packed up Loretta's personal belongings, and even messaged friends pretending that everything was fine. They then fled Halifax in Loretta's car, stopping at gas stations, withdrawing money with her debit card, and continuing life as if nothing had happened. For days, they lived on the run, their calm behavior betraying the brutal act they had just committed. It was only through Victoria's guilt, or perhaps fear, that the truth finally emerged. The public response was immediate and emotional. Vigils were held across Canada. Indigenous communities mourned the loss of a promising young woman who had aimed to make a difference. Activists and allies demanded justice, not only for Loretta but for all the women whose stories ended in silence. Her case became a symbol, a painful reminder of how frequently Indigenous women were targeted and how often their lives were dismissed or devalued. While police finalized the case and prepared charges for murder, Loretta's family faced the unimaginable task of burying their daughter, sister, and friend. They had supported her dreams, celebrated her achievements, and believed she was building a life that would inspire others. Instead, they were left with a legacy shaped by grief but driven by purpose. Loretta's fight was not over. Others would now carry it forward. As the trial began, the courtroom filled with reporters, family members, advocates, and members of the Indigenous community who had followed Loretta Saunders' case from the beginning. The atmosphere was heavy with sorrow and expectation. Both Blake Leggett and Victoria Henbury were charged with first-degree murder, though they eventually pleaded guilty to second-degree murder in separate agreements. The courtroom proceedings provided a detailed, disturbing account of what had happened inside that Halifax apartment. Through forensic reports, digital evidence, and chilling testimony, the truth unfolded in devastating detail. Blake was portrayed as the dominant figure in the relationship, a man with a controlling personality and a violent past. It was revealed that he had changed his name to escape a criminal record and had a history of emotional instability. Victoria, though initially described as passive, had played an active role in helping to clean the apartment, dispose of Loretta's body, and deceive authorities. The judge and prosecution made it clear this was not a spontaneous crime or a panicked accident. It was a deliberate, heartless act, followed by an attempt to erase the victim's existence. Loretta's family sat in the courtroom, listening as the final hours of her life were laid bare. They heard how she had likely begged for her life, how she was killed in the very home she was paying to keep, and how her killers had used her belongings and money to fund their escape. The pain of those details left a permanent mark, but the family stood strong, determined that Loretta's story would not fade into another forgotten statistic. The sentencing reflected the gravity of the crime. Blake Leggett was given a life sentence with no chance of parole for 25 years, the maximum allowed under Canadian law for second-degree murder. Victoria Henbury received life in prison as well, with eligibility for parole after 10 years. Though the sentences brought a sense of justice, there was no true comfort. Loretta's life had been stolen, and no courtroom decision could restore it. In the months that followed, Loretta's name echoed far beyond the legal system. Her thesis was completed posthumously by her professor and her family and published as a way to honor her work. It served as both a memorial and a call to action. Her story was featured in documentaries, public forums, and national campaigns that sought to address the systemic violence faced by Indigenous women. Vigils continued, not just in her memory, but for all the lives cut short by indifference and brutality. Loretta Saunders had once written that every missing Indigenous woman deserved to be heard, that their lives mattered, and that silence was no longer an option. Though she did not live to finish her work, her voice had not been silenced. In death, she became what she had always strived to be in life, a symbol of justice, a reason for change, and a reminder that every voice, no matter how overlooked, deserves to be heard and remembered.